She built an empire worth millions, but she hadn't felt truly powerless in 15 years. Today, that was about to change. No phone, no card, no name that opens doors. For one day, the CEO chose to disappear and become invisible support. She had signed contracts worth millions. Today, she couldn't afford a piece of bread, and no one in this city knew her name. He had almost nothing, and he still gave half of it away to a woman he had no idea was the most powerful person in the city. He shared his last meal with a stranger. He had no idea he was about to change hundreds of lives, starting with his own. If you have ever wondered whether kindness still means something in a world obsessed with money, stay with me until the very last minute of this video, because what you are about to hear will actually change the way one powerful woman saw the entire world. But before we begin, if stories about real human connection move you, hit that like button and subscribe, because it helps this channel keep telling stories that matter. Now, let's begin. Elena Marsh was 34 years old and the CEO of Marsh Logistics Group, a company she had built from a single delivery van into a fleet of 1,200 trucks crossing 11 states. She wore tailored blazers the color of steel, drove a car that cost more than most people's homes, and had not eaten a meal she cooked herself in over 6 years. Her mornings began with spreadsheets and ended with board calls. And somewhere in between the relentless climb to the top, she had stopped remembering what it felt like to need anything from anyone. People who worked under Elena described her in careful, diplomatic language during performance reviews, and in far less diplomatic language over drinks after work. She was brilliant. Everyone agreed on that. She had turned a single delivery van, inherited from her late father's failed courier business, into a logistics empire through sheer force of will, negotiating contracts that veteran executives twice her age couldn't close, memorizing freight routes the way other people memorized song lyrics, and outworking every competitor who assumed a 26-year-old woman couldn't survive a boardroom fight. By 30, she had 300 trucks. By 34, she had 1,200. Offices in 4 cities, and a reputation as someone who never lost a negotiation and never, ever apologized first. What people didn't see, because Elena had built her entire adult identity around making sure they never could, was the girl underneath all of it. 19-year-old Elena Marsh, waitressing double shifts at a diner off Route 30 in Ohio, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 roommates because none of them could afford one alone, learning to stretch a $10 grocery budget across a week by buying dented cans and day-old bread. She remembered, if she let herself, exactly what it felt like to do the math in her head at a checkout counter, praying the total came in under what was in her account. She had promised herself back then that she would never feel that particular helplessness again, and she had kept that promise so thoroughly that she had also, somewhere along the way, forgotten what it meant to anyone else. It was a Tuesday in late October when Elena's therapist, a quiet woman named Dr. Boak, whom Elena saw once a month more out of obligation than belief, said something that lodged itself in her chest like a splinter. "You've built an empire, Dr. Okafor said, but I don't think you've been poor a single day since you were 19. I don't mean money. I mean powerless. When was the last time you needed someone, Elena, and had no way to make them help you?" Elena laughed it off in the room, but she didn't laugh it off in the car. She sat in the back seat of her Mercedes, staring at the tinted window, turning the words over and over. She thought of the woman she used to be, 19 years old, working double shifts at a diner in Ohio, counting coins on a Formica counter to see if she could afford both rent and groceries that month. She thought of how far she had traveled from that girl, and how, somewhere along the way, she had built walls so thick that even her own board members were afraid to disagree with her. That night, unable to sleep, Elena made a decision that her assistant would later call the single strangest instruction in company history. She wanted to disappear. For one day, she wanted to walk through the city with nothing. No phone, no cards, no driver, no name that opened doors. She wanted to know, truly know, what it felt like to be invisible again. Her assistant, a sharp young man named Marcus, tried to talk her out of it. "You have a shareholder call on Thursday," he said. "You have security concerns. You're worth." Elena raised a hand and stopped him. "For one day," she said, "I am worth nothing. That's the point." The next morning, Elena left her penthouse before sunrise. She wore a thrift store coat she had bought secretly online, jeans with a small tear at the knee, and sneakers 2 sizes too worn. She left her phone locked in her desk drawer. She left $20 in her pocket, folded so many times it had gone soft, and nothing else. No cards. No ID with her real title. Just a name, Ellie, and a plan to walk the city like a stranger in her own life. By 9 in the morning, Elena understood something she hadn't expected. The city looked different when no one was rushing to open a door for her. People walked past without meeting her eyes. A barista at a coffee shop glanced at her twice folded 20 and told her, not unkindly, that the smallest coffee was $4.50, and did she want cream. Elena, Ellie, for the day, said yes, and sat by the window, and watched the world move without waiting for her opinion on anything. Around 11, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with appetite and everything to do with math, Elena had walked into a small bakery and asked, quietly, if there was any way to trade a few minutes of dishwashing for a roll or a sandwich. The teenager behind the counter had looked at her with a mixture of confusion and pity, told her the manager didn't allow that kind of thing, and suggested, not unkindly, that there was a shelter 2 miles east that handed out meals at noon. Elena had thanked her and walked out, her face hot with something she didn't have a name for yet, something that 34 years of boardrooms had never once made her feel. It wasn't embarrassment exactly. It was closer to erasure, the specific, disorienting sensation of asking for the smallest possible thing and being told, gently but firmly, that she did not qualify for it. She had signed contracts worth more than that bakery would earn in a decade, and none of that mattered here, because here, none of it existed. Here, she was only what she looked like, tired, thin-walleted, and easy to overlook. By noon, her $20 had become $6. She had bought a coffee, a subway ticket she didn't need, but took out of curiosity, and a granola bar from a corner store because her stomach had started to ache, in a way she had genuinely forgotten it could. She walked for hours. Her feet, unaccustomed to sneakers that weren't broken in by a stylist, began to blister. She sat on a bench in a small park near the edge of downtown, the kind of park with cracked pavement and a fountain that hadn't run in years, and for the first time in over a decade, Elena Marsh felt something close to fear. Not danger, just smallness. The particular, humbling smallness of not knowing where her next meal would come from. It was there, on that bench, that she met Daniel Reyes. That same morning had started, for Daniel, at 5:15, the way it always did. An alarm buzzing against the nightstand, the quiet scramble to get Mia dressed and fed, before the school bus came at 7:40. He'd made her oatmeal with a spoonful of brown sugar, because that was the one small luxury the budget still allowed, and he'd listened, half awake, as she explained in exhaustive 7-year-old detail why octopuses were smarter than most and adults she knew. He'd packed her lunch, the peanut butter sandwich, the half apple, a note on a napkin that said, "Proud of you, Mia Bug," because his late wife used to write those notes, and he'd decided, the week after the funeral, that Mia would never go a school day without one, even if writing it made his throat tight every single time. He'd walked her to the bus stop, waved until it turned the corner, and then he'd had exactly 6 hours before his sister could take her for the evening. 6 hours to run errands, nap if his body allowed it, and sit, just for a little while, in the park near his apartment, where the fountain didn't run, but the trees still turned gold in October, same as anywhere else. Daniel was 38, though the lines on his face and the gray threading through his dark hair made him look older, the way hard years often do to gentle men. He worked the overnight shift at a shipping warehouse, coincidentally, though neither of them knew it yet, one of the many logistics companies that competed for contracts against Elena's, and he was raising his 7-year-old daughter, Mia, alone since his wife had passed 2 years earlier. He came to that same park bench most afternoons before his shift, because it was the only quiet half hour he had between picking Mia up from school, dropping her at his sister's apartment for the evening, and heading to work. That day, Daniel was eating a sandwich, the same kind he packed every day, 2 slices of bread, a thin layer of peanut butter, because the jar of jam had run out, and he hadn't had the money to replace it, and an apple he'd cut in half, so Mia could have the other portion for her lunch tomorrow. It wasn't much. It was, in fact, all he had until his next paycheck, which was still 4 days away. Elena sat 2 feet from him, staring at nothing, and Daniel, who had spent his whole life reading rooms because reading rooms had kept him and his daughter fed, noticed the particular exhaustion on her face. Not the exhaustion of a bad day, the exhaustion of someone who hadn't eaten and didn't know how to ask. "You hungry?" he asked, not looking up right away, giving her the dignity of not being stared at. Elena, Ellie, hesitated. Pride, even stripped of every material thing, does not disappear easily. I'm fine, she said, the old reflex of a CEO who never admitted need. Daniel didn't push. He simply tore his sandwich in half, the half meant for Mia, lunch, and set it on a napkin between them. I made too much, he lied gently. The kind of lie that costs the liar something and costs the receiver nothing. Somebody should eat it before the pigeons do. Elena looked at the sandwich. She looked at this stranger, in a faded work jacket with a company logo half peeled off, with tired eyes and calloused hands, offering her half of what was very obviously not too much of anything. And something in her chest, something that had been locked since a 19-year-old girl in Stame, Ohio, decided that needing help was a weakness, cracked open. Thank you, she said quietly. And she meant it more than she had meant anything she'd said in a boardroom in years. They talked for the better part of an hour. Daniel told her about Mia, how she wanted to be a marine biologist, how she'd taped a hand-drawn picture of a whale to their refrigerator, how he was terrified every single day that he wasn't doing enough for her, that working nights meant missing bedtime, that grief and single fatherhood had taught him to measure his life in small, exhausting victories. A packed lunch, a clean uniform for school, a bedtime story read over video call from the break room at midnight. Elena told him almost nothing true. She couldn't, not yet. But she asked questions. Real questions. The kind she hadn't asked another human being in longer than she could remember. She asked what kept him going. Daniel shrugged, wrapping the other half of his own sandwich back up to save for later. You do what you have to for the people who need you, he said. That's it. That's the whole secret. There isn't a bigger one. When it was time for him to leave for his shift, Daniel stood, brushed the crumbs from his jacket, and said something that Elena would carry with her long after that bench, long after that day. Whatever you're going through, he said, it's not going to be like this forever. Bad days end. They just take their time about it. Then he smiled, a tired, genuine smile, and walked off toward the bus stop, toward a warehouse, toward a paycheck that was still 4 days away, and a daughter who was waiting for him to come home, safe. Elena sat on that bench for a long time after he left. She thought about the empire she had built, the 1,200 trucks, the boardrooms, the wealth that could have fed 100 families like Daniel's without her ever noticing the loss. And she thought about how a man with almost nothing had given her half of it without a second thought, simply because he saw a stranger who looked hungry. She went home that night, walked, actually, all the way back to her building, because $6 didn't stretch to a cab, and she did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen island, the one that had never once held a home-cooked meal, and she opened her laptop and searched 2 things. Marsh Logistics Group warehouse night shift, and, quietly, almost as an afterthought, Single Father Support Program City. The next morning, Marcus found her already at her desk when he arrived, hours before her usual start. I need a personnel file, Elena said. Warehouse division, overnight shift, Reyes. Daniel Reyes. Marcus pulled it up within minutes, because that was his job. And Elena scrolled through it in silence. Hire date, performance reviews, excellent. Every single one. A note from a supervisor 2 years prior about a leave of absence following. The death of an employee's spouse. And a starting wage that made Elena's stomach turn in a way that no boardroom failure ever had. She had built a company on the backs of people like Daniel Reyes and had never once looked at their faces. She didn't storm in with grand gestures that day. She was too smart and too changed by that bench to think a single dramatic check would fix what was actually broken. Instead, she spent the next 6 weeks doing something her board found baffling and her employees found, at first, suspicious. She sat in on warehouse shifts anonymously, not as Ellie this time, but honestly, as a new operations consultant, because she needed to see her own company from the floor up. She listened to overnight workers talk about missed dinners, missed school plays, missed birthdays, about wages that hadn't moved in 3 years while delivery quotas had doubled. She listened, and for the first time since she was 19, she let herself feel the cost of what she had built without noticing who was paying for it. In the second week, she rode along on a pre-dawn delivery route with a driver named Priyanka, who had worked for Marsh Logistics for 9 years and had never once met anyone from the executive floor. Priyanka talked, unguarded, because she assumed the quiet woman beside her was just another new hire shadowing the route, about how she'd missed her son's entire kindergarten graduation because a schedule change came through, with 2 hours notice and no one to cover her shift. In the 4th week, Elena sat in the break room at 2 in the morning and listened to 3 warehouse workers debate. half joking and half not, whether it was cheaper to buy groceries or gas that week, because rarely could anyone afford both in the same paycheck. She wrote none of it down in front of them. She wrote all of it down the second she got home, in a notebook she kept locked in a drawer, page after page of names and numbers and small, devastating details that no quarterly report had ever captured. By the 5th week, she had stopped thinking of the restructuring as a project and started thinking of it as a debt she was finally getting around to paying. She met with her CFO, a cautious man named Whitfield, who had built his career on protecting margins, and when he warned her that a 30% shift differential increase would materially affect quarterly guidance, Elena looked at him for a long moment and said, "Then we'll materially affect it. I'd rather explain a smaller number to shareholders than keep explaining an empty conscience to myself." Whitfield didn't argue further. He had never seen her speak that way before, and something about the certainty in her voice told him this wasn't a fight worth having. When Elena finally presented the restructuring plan to the full board, she didn't open with charts. She opened with a story about a park bench, told without names, about a stranger who gave away half of everything he had to someone he assumed needed it more than he did. 2 board members exchanged skeptical glances. A third, an older man named Halloran, who had been with the company since its early days, listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening slightly at the mention of wages that hadn't moved in 3 years. When Elena finished, the room was quiet for a moment before Halloran spoke. "Your father would have hated the margins on this," he said, "and loved everything else about it." The vote, when it came, wasn't unanimous, but it passed, and Elena walked out of that boardroom feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, proud not of what she'd won, but of what she'd finally agreed to give up. 6 weeks later, Marsh Logistics Group announced a restructuring. Overnight shift differentials increased by 30%. A company-funded on-site childcare partnership launched at the 3 largest warehouses, with priority slots for single parents. A grief and hardship leave policy was written into the employee handbook. Real leave, paid, not the awkward unpaid absence Daniel had cobbled together after his wife died. None of it was announced with Elena's name attached. She didn't want credit. She wanted correction. It was almost 3 months after that day on the park bench that Daniel Reyes was called into a small conference room at the warehouse, nervous the way anyone is nervous when management asks to see them personally. He expected bad news. Cutbacks maybe, or a write-up he didn't remember earning. Instead, a woman in a gray blazer stood when he walked in, and it took him a full 3 seconds. 3 seconds that felt much longer to both of them, to recognize the face beneath the boardroom with polish. "Ellie?" he said, genuinely stunned, the coffee cup in his hand nearly slipping. "Elena, actually," she said, and there was something almost shy in the way she said it. The CEO of a 1,200 truck company, suddenly unsure of her own footing in front of a warehouse worker who had once given her half a sandwich. "I should have told you the truth on that bench. I'm sorry I didn't." Daniel sat down slowly, the pieces assembling themselves. The park bench, the 2 simple questions about how he kept going, the odd way the consultant who'd shadowed his shift last month had watched him with an intensity that seemed too personal for someone just doing an audit. "You run this company," he said. It wasn't a question. "I do," Elena said, and then, because he deserved the whole truth and not a polished version of it, she kept going. "That day on the bench wasn't a publicity idea, and it wasn't a game. My therapist told me I hadn't been powerless since I was 19, and it made me furious. And then it made me think. And then I found myself walking around this city with $6 in my pocket, and no idea how I was going to eat. I wasn't testing you, Daniel. I didn't know you. I was just hungry, and scared in a way I hadn't let myself be in 15 years. And you didn't ask me a single question before you tore your daughter's lunch in half." Daniel exhaled slowly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I gave away her sandwich," he said, half to himself, shaking his head with the disbelief of a man realizing, months later, exactly what he'd risked. "I got home that night and told her I'd eaten mine at work, so hers was safe. I lied to a 7-year-old, so she wouldn't worry about a stranger on a bench. And 3 months ago, on a bench I never should have been sitting on, a man who had almost nothing gave me half of it without hesitation, because he thought I was hungry and needed help. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask what you'd get out of it. You just helped." Her voice caught, and for a woman who had negotiated 8-figure contracts without blinking, that surprised her more than anyone in the room. "I've spent 6 weeks trying to figure out how to build a company that would have made that day unnecessary for you. I don't know if I've fixed it, But I wanted you to be the first person to know what changed and why. She told him then about the wage increases, the childcare program, the leave policy. Not as a reward for him specifically, she was careful to say, but because his cold kindness had forced her to actually look at the thousands of people like him that her company once depended on and had for years quietly failed. And then she told him something else, that Marsh Logistics was launching a scholarship, mentorship fund for the children of frontline employees, starting with marine biology camp, enrollment for one particular 7-year-old who had a hand-drawn whale taped to her refrigerator, if her father was willing. Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I didn't give you half a sandwich because I wanted anything back, he said. I gave it to you because you looked like someone who needed it. That's still true, isn't it? Everybody needs somebody to notice, sooner or later. Rich or not. Yes, Elena said. It's still true. It might be the truest thing anyone's ever told me. In the months that followed, Elena didn't disappear back into the isolated tower she'd built for herself. She kept the coat from that day, the thrift store coat, thin and unremarkable, folded in her office closet, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the particular ache of not knowing where a meal was coming from, and of the particular grace of a stranger who filled that gap without being asked twice. Daniel, for his part, stayed on the overnight shift by choice, though now with a schedule that let him be home for more bedtimes, a childcare slot that meant Mia wasn't spending every evening at her aunt's apartment, and a paycheck that finally matched the work he'd always quietly, faithfully done. They didn't become some improbable fairy tale couple, because that isn't what this story is about, and pretending otherwise would cheapen what actually happened between them. What they became was something rarer and, in its own way, more remarkable. Two people from opposite ends of a system that too often keeps people like them from ever truly seeing each other, who chose, on one ordinary Tuesday, on one cracked park bench, to treat a stranger like a human being first and a category second. Elena kept showing up at that park on her lunch breaks, sometimes with coffee for two, sometimes just to sit, and slowly, without either of them naming it, a genuine friendship grew between a CEO who had learned what it meant to be poor for a single day and a single father who had never once needed a title to know how to be kind. A year later, at the company's annual town hall, Elena stood in front of every employee, warehouse workers, drivers, office staff, the people who kept 1,200 trucks moving across 11 states, and told them the story of a stranger on a bench, without using anyone's name, without asking for applause. She told them that leadership, real leadership, wasn't something you could learn in a boardroom. It was something you learned on a park bench with $6 in your pocket, and a stranger who had less than you and gave anyway. I built this company to move packages faster than anyone else, she told them, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been on that bench a year earlier. I forgot, for a long time, that I built it on the backs of people, not packages. I won't forget again. Somewhere near the back of that room, Daniel Reyes stood with his arms crossed, a small, quiet smile on his face, thinking about a half sandwich he'd given away without a second thought, and about how the smallest acts of kindness, the ones we do expecting absolutely nothing in return, have a way of traveling further than we could ever imagine, sometimes all the way back to change the very system we thought would never notice us at all. That same summer, Mia Reyes packed a small duffel bag covered in stickers of sea turtles and boarded a bus bound for a 2-week marine biology camp on the coast, the first vacation of any kind that she or her father had ever taken. Daniel stood at the curb longer than the bus needed him to, waving even after it had turned the corner, the same way he'd waved at her school bus a year earlier on an ordinary Tuesday morning that neither of them had known would change everything. When Mia came home 2 weeks later, sunburned and talking faster than her father could follow, she pulled a photograph from her bag, herself standing beside a real marine biologist, both of them grinning beside a tank of gliding stingrays, and taped it right next to the hand-drawn castor tray, whale still hanging on their refrigerator. "See, Dad," she said, tapping the photo with the fierce confidence of a 7-year-old who had just met her future. "I told you it was real. All of it. It's real." Daniel looked at the photo for a long time after she went to bed that night. He thought about the sandwich, the bench, the woman named Ellie, who turned out to be someone else entirely, and the strange, quiet way that one small offer of half a lunch, given to a stranger who looked like she needed it, had somehow found its way back around to his daughter's future. He didn't understand all the mechanics of how kindness traveled that far. He didn't think he needed to. He just understood, the way he'd always understood the important things. That you took care of the people in front of you, and sometimes, if you were lucky, the world found a way to take care of you back. A few weeks after the town hall, Elena sat in Dr. Okafor's office again, in the same chair she'd sat in the day. The question about powerlessness first cracked something open in her. You look different, Dr. Okafor said, studying her. Lighter, maybe. I went and found out what I'd forgotten, Elena said. You were right. I hadn't been powerless in 15 years. I hadn't been much of anything real in 15 years, if I'm honest. I forgot that the whole point of building something was supposed to be who it helps, not just how big it gets. And now, Elena thought of the bench, the torn sandwich, Daniel's tired, kind eyes, Mia's photograph with the stingrays, the notebook full of names locked in her drawer that she still added to every week. Now I know what I'm building it for, she said. That's not nothing. That might be everything. If this story moved you even a little, remember that you don't need a fortune to change someone's life. Sometimes all it takes is half a sandwich, a seat on a bench, and the willingness to see a stranger as someone worth helping. If you believe that too, make sure you're subscribed, because we have so many more stories like this one still to tell, and we've fleed the love for you to be here for every single one.